Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Alexander Ochs. I'm CEO of Berlin think tank SD Strategies, and I'm chair of the Energy Working Group of the Let's Global Partnership, which I'm going to introduce to you in a moment. Thanks a lot for joining. We had very high interest in this session. I think about 300 registrations. I hope as many as possible have made it to join us today. We're not doing this from SDS headquarters, but from RENAG, from the Renewable Energy Academy in Berlin. Thank you very much, RENAG, for hosting us. They have this exciting conference facilities that we're using for this here today. These are extremely challenging times for all of us. We're confronted with a global pandemic that has already cost hundreds of thousands of lives and arguably affected all of us. Wherever we live. So wherever you are calling from, we hope you're staying safe and you remain in good spirits. We will continue to battle this pandemic, this disease, and we will ultimately defeat it. But what we are addressing here is what is next then? What will the world look like after COVID-19? And we want to discuss how we deal with the many challenges and the many problems that are created through this pandemic beyond the very important health issue and the way we directly respond to the health crisis. One thing that we already see unfold is an economic crisis of enormous dimensions. The economic impact has been estimated at about $12 trillion. Just the direct impact of the crises. The global economy will shrink this year by, projections are about 5% of GDP. Just to put this number into perspective, if you remember the Stern report a little bit more than 10 years ago, it estimated the cost of addressing climate change, mitigating climate change and keeping it below 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius at about 2% of our GDP, 1 to 2% of our GDP. And that was not counting the positive co-benefits that could be created by the investments necessary to mitigate climate change. So here's a quite dramatic comparison. So what is our response? Governments around the world currently negotiate trillion euro recovery packages to address the economic crisis and move their countries out of the recession. Key goals are commonly to save jobs, of course, to support businesses, to return to economic growth. The UN estimates that COVID-19 can result in job losses of up to 200 million people worldwide. So these are extremely pressing challenges. To address the immediate recession is, of course, a very important goal. But I think arguably it's not the only challenges we're dealing with. It's not the only goals that we have set for ourselves. We are currently facing an unprecedented environmental crisis. Climate change has been called by many observers the world's greatest challenge in the 21st century. The quick loss of biodiversity of entire ecosystems, nature's decline has been called dangerous and unprecedented, and there's many other human challenges that have been with us throughout our history that we are really trying to address at this time with a very courageous agenda. The problems are poverty, racial and gender inequality, lack of access to food, clean water, energy, health services. All of this prevents the pursuit of happiness for so many people worldwide, the pursuit of dignified and fulfilled lives globally. So the global community has started to respond to this. The UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement try to tackle climate change. There's a biodiversity convention. There's a habitat program that addresses, and several other multilateral agreements that fight environmental degradation. Above all of it is the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. That have been almost universally agreed by now and that want to achieve no later than in 10 years from now, in 2030, and very ambitious agenda: no poverty, zero hunger, clean water and sanitation, protection of life on land and underwater, sustainable cities and communities, just to name a few. Altogether, 17 sustainable development goals and more than 100 targets have been set, broadly accepted, measurable indicators exist that can help us to measure our behavior, to measure the behavior of government, societies, and for all of us. The question now is, how do the short-term investments that are needed to tackle the economic crisis, how do they relate to the midterm and the long-term sustainable development goals that we have set for ourselves? Is there a risk that we are locking in climate and SDG incompatible technologies and practices for the sake of short-term economic relief? And most observers agree that this risk in far exists. The decisions that we are making in the coming months will determine if the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals remain within reach. This current social and economic crisis might be our last chance to really initiate the deep transitions that are needed to put humanity on the right path. So this is what we will discuss today in the second session of this three-part mini-series, an online discussion that we do on assisting post-pandemic transitions in developing countries. We're trying to discuss whether the SDGs can act as yardsticks for public investments, and we focus specifically on the energy and transport sectors. Why the energy and transport sectors? Both sectors, of course, have utmost importance for climate, for sustainable development. Energy is the biggest impact sector. Transport is the fastest growing sector. So this is why we've picked these two sectors. A second focus is the focus on developing countries that I think distinguishes us a little bit from the plethora, the many other current discussions on green recovery, on a Green Deal. And why do we focus on developing countries? Developing countries arguably have the most to lose from embarking on the wrong pathway, but maybe also the greatest opportunities to make a contribution, to leapfrog certain technologies and get to the goals that they have set for themselves quicker. But they have received very limited attention in the global debate so far, so this is something that we're trying to change. Now, this series is designed as a capacity building initiative. We hope to provide some guidance or at least some ideas, some food for thought for how to design recovery plans in developing countries. Or maybe we shouldn't call it recovery, maybe we should start calling it stimulus packages, because we don't want to return to a state of the economy where we were before, but create something new and proactively direct ourselves towards the sustainable development goals. Now, this is, of course, a very ambitious undertaking, and I'm very glad that I don't have to tackle this by myself or just with my small team, but we found excellent speakers throughout this series, including today, who will help us explore these sessions. Before I'm jumping into today's session, I wanted to give you a very short and brief summary of where we left the discussion last week at our first session. The recording is online on the SD Strategies website and will soon be on the Let's GP website as well. What were some of the key findings from last week? One is there was agreement that we can do both. We can come out of the COVID-19 crisis and tackle climate change and make significant progress towards the sustainable development goals. The immediate recovery must be combined with long-term sustainability, and to successfully tackle climate change and achieve the sustainable development goals, we need to dramatically increase investment in renewable energy, energy efficiency, electrification, clean electrification, and sustainable transport. Otherwise, we will fail. It is clear that we will fail with very dramatic consequences. The good news is there have never been better times to get to the deep transitions that we need to see. In the last crisis, for example, in 1998, not the last human crisis, arguably, but the last deep financial crisis in 1998, some 12 years ago, renewable costs, just as one example, were very, very high. This is different now. Climate protection has been proven to be an economic driver. It can stimulate the economy and it can create more jobs, and it has successfully done this in the past. We need to, that was where the discussion then spent a lot of time, we need to move to innovative markets that stimulate the economy. Energy efficiency, renewable, sustainable mobility, I mentioned those already, also sustainable water management, a circular economy, recycling. The green stimuli can be applied to many sectors, and it can multiply a broad range of benefits. And this is really country specific where exactly investments should go. But one thing is they have in common, the focus should be on innovative solutions. That focus cannot be overstated. One example, former coal regions can be excellent locations for utility scale solar and benefit many sustainable development goals of local populations there. We will summarize this also in blog form. I'm not going to go through more notes, though they are quite exciting, but rather going to move on and move to today's discussion. I hope you can see this well. This is our excellent set of speakers that we have today. I'm going to introduce them to you one by one when their time is up to kick off with a few thoughts on their behalf. This is the agenda for today. We're right in the midst of the introduction. Of course, then the panelists will kick off the session. Then we have to skip this third point. Unfortunately, we were hoping that the Asia Let's platform, Asia Let's partnership, will talk about their green recovery work. But unfortunately, our speaker there got sick last minute, and we couldn't find a subsidy. It's in the evening hours now across Asia. That's unfortunate, but that's the good part of it is that gives us more time for the Q&A session with the global audience of participants from all across the world. Again, we want trying to make this very interactive. So for those of you who are not panelists but are calling in to listen, don't just listen. Get involved with us. You have two opportunities to do so. There's a chat window where you can comment on what we say, but there's also the opportunity for you to ask questions, to vote questions up in their ranking, and I will do my very best together with my team to then bring forward these questions to the panelists. Talking about being interactive, those of you who are tweeting, we encourage you to do this. Please include the hashtag SDG Stimuli, beautiful melody, SDG Stimuli, and don't forget to also copy the Let's GP at Let's GP, so that we're aware of who you are and that you got active and involved with us. Very briefly about who is enabling us to do all this. The Let's Global Partnership is in its 10th year now. It's our 10th anniversary this year. Let's obviously stands for Low Emission Development Strategies. It's a global partnership with 120 countries, 350 plus institutions, about 5,000 members actively involved. It is a network for peer learning, for collaborative efforts, for information exchange. Our goal is to implement ambitious LEDs and NDCs and do this in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. What is different, or what makes the Let's GP special, I find, is that it's really a country and demand-driven process. We often act as co-pilots of what countries want to do. They define the agenda, they come to us with technical assistance requests, with the issues they want to work on, with the policies they want to improve, with the measures that they want to think through, and we help them to our very best capabilities to achieve that. The center of gravity in the Let's Global Partnership are the regional platforms. There are established platforms in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America and the Caribbean. They really lead the process to bring forward the requests of their members. Here you see the 3 regional platforms again. I'm chairing the Energy Working Group very much since the beginning of the Let's Global Partnership. Our main role is to support the regions in achieving what they do want to achieve. We have specific areas in which we get active, and this work program is set by the regional platforms, and we support them in this. We work on mini grids in Africa. We work on bioenergy in Latin America and the Caribbean. We work on large-scale grid integration of renewables in Asia. These are just some of the current highlights. This is my organization, ST Strategies. We wanted to include this in the slide deck for obvious reasons, but I'm going to skip this now in the interest of time. The objective of the series is not just to show programs, to show proposals, green recovery packages, but to get behind them, to figure out what could be the key rationales for setting them. How do you select specific policies and measures over others? What are the indicators for designing these packages? So, objectives of the session, I think I've turned to, it's the rationales behind things, the potential of sustainable public investments, the priorities, the opportunities that green stimuli can produce. These are some of the key questions, mostly really for the interest of the slide deck, to have that in a complete manner. I think I've been touching on this, and we will throughout the session. It's important to mention once again that this is the 2nd out of 3rd sessions. Here is the date and the time of the 3rd session, next week, Thursday, 9th of July, 3 o'clock European time. Then the focus will be mostly on international cooperation. How can it be improved towards effective green stimulus packages? Today, it's mostly about the concepts and looking behind them. The first session was laying the basis for our understanding of what green recovery is. You can find these recordings, as I mentioned, online. All right, this was a lengthy introduction, but I hope it sets the right course for the discussion today. And I'm very excited to now introduce to you our very first speaker. If I find the speaker card, that will be helpful here. But I think I will be able to. Let me check out here. Yes, here we go. So our first speaker is joining us from New Delhi. His name is Dr. Rajat Kathuria. He is the Director and Chief Executive at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, also based in New Delhi. He has more than 20 years of experience of teaching economic policy. He's worked with various international organizations, including the World Bank, the International Labour Organization, UNCTAD, and ADB. He has a bachelor's and a master's and a PhD in economics from several universities, St. Stephen's College, Delhi School of Economics, and the University of Maryland. Now I'd like to ask Rajat. Rajat, can you open your microphone and your video, please? And then my colleague will run through your slides.
Wonderful.
Rajat?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Alexander. And thank you very much for having me here. It's a delight to be able to speak to a global audience on what I think could be opportunities for India as a part of its, what you call the stimulus package. Before I start talking about my slide deck, let me just share a little bit about ICRIER, the Indian Council on International Economic Relations. ICRIER is a think tank, as you said, Alexander, based in New Delhi, and we've been around since 1981. And we've been working on several areas of economic policy, including now increasingly on climate change and environment, and on cities and urbanization and agriculture. And I'll be happy to share more details about what we do. We only work on economic policy. And we work with multilateral agencies, we work with governments, and we are hoping that as a result of this crisis, we are able to deepen our work on sustainability and inclusion. And I'm going to talk you through a little bit about sustainability and inclusion, because that seems to be really critical for India's green growth strategies. If India has to grow, it has to grow green, but at the same time, it has to grow in an inclusive manner, in a sustainable manner. So with these words, let me sort of go through my slide deck, and I will be happy to address any questions at the later stage. So as Alexander said, various countries have defined stimulus packages, fiscal stimulus packages, monetary packages, etc. And India's own package was about 10% of GDP and 21 lakh crores. Forget the sort of Indian units of the rupees. You can convert them into dollars by using an exchange rate of about 75 as it is today, but about 10% of GDP. And along with that, we did a little bit of structural reform. And I'm emphasizing this because structural reform is something that we need to do desperately if we have to go onto a path of green recovery and not go down the business as usual path. The package that was designed was partly sort of fiscal, but it was mostly, can you go back to the previous slide? It was mostly sort of a liquidity support and a monetary package, and it covered medium and small enterprises, migrant workers, the agricultural sector, healthcare provision of loans, partial credit guarantee schemes, direct credit transfers, etc. A lot of liquidity injections to ensure that companies and small and medium enterprises stay afloat and do not shed jobs. Unfortunately, there was a huge loss of jobs in India following COVID because of a number of people sort of being in the informal sector in temporary jobs, did not have any sustenance. Small and medium enterprises shut down. Agriculture wasn't hiring as many people in the informal sector, and therefore 90% of India's labor force that is in the informal sector, a lot of them, an overwhelming percentage of them, had to be rendered unemployed, which is why all this support, liquidity support and direct benefit transfers was instituted by the government to ensure that these people continued to have means of livelihood. The trade-off between lives and livelihoods, etc., played out in India as well. We had a lockdown, extended lockdown. Some states are continuing that lockdown in India until July 31st, and that lockdown continues, although there's been some calibrated lifting of the lockdown in India. I think this is a big opportunity for India to engage in what I've been calling structural reform. And the reason I say that, India's last structural reform that happened was way back in 1991. And after that, we've done a lot of incremental reform. And 1991 was the time when we had a balance of payment and a macroeconomic crisis. And we borrowed funds from the IMF, we borrowed funds from other sort of donors. And there was some reform that we engaged in. It was largely limited to what is called product market reforms. And it was not so much in the financial sector, it was not so much green. But as a result of that reform, India began to grow very, very rapidly. And just in the decade, before this decade, we were growing very rapidly, and India would sort of boast about being one of the fastest growing emerging markets in the world. Just a few months later, we are now in a crisis situation. Our growth rate is expected to decline by about 5% if you look at the recent predictions of the IMF. But I think when we recalibrate our growth, this is an opportunity to sort of restructure and reboot the growth model, because, as I said, our previous reform gave us a huge impetus to growth, but that growth compromised a lot of inclusion. The growth was not inclusive, and certainly the growth was not sustainable, because it had adverse impacts on our air quality, it had adverse impacts on water, it had adverse impacts on agriculture, etc. So that growth wasn't sustainable. And unfortunately, the growth was also not inclusive, And we know that climate change and air quality impacts are disproportionately felt on the poor. And therefore, this is an opportunity as we reboot, as we move to a clean energy transition in the transport and power sectors. Alexander, as you emphasized, this is an opportunity for India to actually reboot the growth model and leapfrog. It is going to be very difficult to do that. I recognize that because there's a political economy of reform, and the immediate sort of impetus and the immediate need for India and several other countries is to restore that economy and to restore jobs so that jobs that have been lost can be brought back on stream, and companies that are on the verge of collapse are sustained so that they can grow. But this, as I said, is an opportunity to reboot that growth model. Next slide, please. With those sort of introductory remarks, let me say that, I won't go through each item on the slide, but I think this is an opportunity, as I said, for India. We've recognized that, a lack of growth gives us a slowdown or a stoppage of the growth gives us, a much better environment. And India's greenhouse gas emissions have fallen for the first time in 4 decades. And a lot of people are asking, why can't we have that even while we have a growth model? And let me just say at this point that when ICRIER was doing work on climate change, we had collaborated with a new climate economy institution, which was a global institution, which continues to exist in a different form today. But one of the major learnings from that engagement for ICRIER and for the many other institutions that were involved in that was that it is not necessary for growth, which is so important for India because it lifts many people out of poverty and it creates jobs. You can have a growth model that doesn't necessarily compromise your climate goals. And therefore, growth and climate, which were traditionally seen as trade-offs, need not be trade-offs. And that was the big change that we were able to show through our research. Of course, that needs to have application at the policy level, that needs to have sort of greater diffusion into civil society. But I think we've begun to make that change in India, that there is a possibility that growth and climate goals need not conflict. And there are several things that we can do to ensure that doesn't happen, in the sense that both of them can proceed simultaneously. And the thing that I wish to emphasize here, we would need a lot of change in perception, but we will also need a lot of policy support. And I think that policy support can come both from the state governments in India as well as from the central governments. And in the current sort of situation and the current discussion that we are having in India is how do you reform, how do you engage in structural reform in the power sector? And in the power sector, I mean, central to power sector reform in India, I think, and to make it green and to make it sort of decarbonized, and given that the power sector contributes about 35% of the emissions in India, I think the central or the first piece of reform that I would encourage the Indian government to do is to try and reform the distribution companies and make the distribution companies much more sort of resilient, make the distribution companies profit-making, look at the tariff structures that are embedded in the power sector, look at the regulations, ensure that there is sort of power purchase agreements give much more benefit to renewable energy. Just as an aside, we've sort of liberalized coal mining recently as a part of the structural reform or the part of the package that was announced by the government. And a lot of people say that commercial coal mining and our long-term goals in terms of a green economy, they may not be compatible. But this is something that we need to discuss, given that the coal economy in India is very important, not only for jobs, for power generation also. So it has to be a calibrated shift away from coal towards renewable. And at the heart of that, I think we need to have a reform of the distribution companies. And the government has given about 90,000 crores, which is about $12 billion in terms of liquidity support to the distribution companies. The second piece of reform that I think we can have, given that there's been a big impact on mobility, there's been a huge decline both in passenger and freight mobility in India, and there could be a rebound to business as usual. But government of India has many packages to develop more electric mobility, to have more electric vehicle manufacturing facilities in India, and those reforms should be pushed through. And as I've been saying, the opportunity that this crisis gives us to introduce those and to implement those is something that we won't see during a business as usual development paradigm. When things are good, it's difficult to change the status quo. When things are bad, as I said, just like we did in 1991, this is an opportunity to reboot the growth model. I recognize that we will be focusing a lot on addressing financial constraints, a lot of making our supply chains more resilient, especially between what is happening between India and China today. We'll want to make our supply chain resilient. We want to domesticate some of those supply chains. And there's no harm in doing that, provided we do that in a manner that is green, that is decarbonized, and that also is able to create more jobs. Next slide, please. And I'll quickly wrap up. I know my time is up. So as I said, discoms would have to be at the center of our reform strategy going forward, and that will be able to have positive spillover benefits on renewable energy, on the sort of sustainability. And we have seen that certain investments have been into India in the renewable energy sector. And the government of India has recently set up a project development cell for the purpose of attracting more investments to support the target of renewable energy that we have committed in Paris. And there's an additional incremental, it's not incremental, it's a very large change on what we had committed in Paris. We had committed in Paris to about 175 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022. The Prime Minister has recently announced a 500 gigawatt. So that is sort of amazing in terms of its aspiration and ambition. By 2030, we wish to move up to 500 gigawatts of renewable energy. And I think that provides a good hook. Even if we are not able to achieve that, it provides a good hook to try and see how we need to reform both our manufacturing and distribution to be able to try and achieve that target. And that's why this is an opportunity to do that. And my final slide is, how do you incorporate sustainability in India's post-pandemic economic response? And I think the NITI Aayog, India's knowledge bank, which advises the government on its economic policies, has sort of, for the transport sector and the power sector, it came out with a report, even just a couple of days before this. So this fortuitous in some sense. They're saying the same things that a lot of people have been saying, that in the transport sector, we need to have more electric mobility, we need to have more shared transport, we need to get away from sort of personalized, individual transport to either work from home or to shared mobility and to electric mobility. And there are packages that could be put in place and that have been put in place. And if enforced, I think that would lead to a sort of a transition, a good transition, a green transition in the mobility sector. There are a number of things that need to happen. I'll be happy to talk to you about during the question session, is that we move away in freight, we move away from road to railways, which is less sort of polluting. We move away from diesel and fossil fuels into electrification. We have improve our infrastructure for electrification so that charging can happen. That fossil fuel infrastructure has been built over 75 to 100 years across the world. And therefore, to dismantle that, to disengage from that infrastructure will take some doing, not only in developing countries, but in every country. And I think emerging markets have the advantage that they may not be so entrenched. So as Alexander was saying, one can actually leapfrog to a greener mobile sector. And car ownership in India, personal car ownership in India is very low compared to the rest of the world. And we don't want to increase that. We don't want to encourage that. So building a good shared mobility, building a good public transportation will serve the purpose. And in the power sector, as I said, encourage renewables, local manufacturing of renewables so that you can create more jobs, because jobs has to drive this agenda of green. If you look at the green agenda for India, and as you were talking about sustainable development goals, Alexander, I think if you look at the green agenda and the sustainable development agenda, looking at it from the prism of creating new jobs, looking at the prism of creating green jobs will be very beneficial for the political economy of reform in India. Otherwise, we would be talking about the same thing over and over again, especially in countries like India, if you don't address the jobs agenda. So whatever we do with the green agenda, the green stimulus package, as I said, right now the focus is on recovery. But when we sort of at the stage where we sort of bounce back, reform and transform, if we place jobs at the center, then it will be much easier to reform and put in place those reforms in an emerging markets like India, where the demographics are such that 5 million people enter the labor force every year. So jobs has to be center of our green and development agenda. I know I've taken more time than was allotted to me. Apologies for that, but I'll stop here, Alexander.
It was absolutely fascinating, and since we've lost one segment, and that's when the Asia Labs platform that I know is very actively working with India. It's one of the really countries that shows a lot of leadership within the Let's GP. Since we don't have that contribution, that saves us a little bit of time. It was very difficult for me. I'm usually a strong moderator and cut people off, but this was so exciting that I didn't really want to do this. Thank you, Rajat. It was a wonderful introduction of your thoughts, a wonderful perspective from India. Enormous challenges, obviously, but I'm grateful that you left it on a very positive note of opportunities and of hope. Let us turn to our next panelist, who is joining us from Brussels, Martin Kasper. Martin is a policy officer at the Climate Finance Unit of the Directorate General for Climate in the European Commission. He has a PhD in political science and has a professional background on climate, environment, and worked also on these issues very much from a development perspective. So he's a fabulous candidate to discuss with us today. He has worked in 2 EU delegations. He was very involved in the Let's Global Partnership, mostly working with the Africa Let's project. He's a member of the negotiation team to the UNFCCC climate negotiations, and works also on EU international relations, foreign relations with a number of Asian and African countries. So it's a very broad perspective, and that's exactly what we were looking for and why we asked him to contribute today. Now, I know we are sharing slides, and my colleague had to jump in between PowerPoints. Is his slide deck ready set up? He's only speaking, I'm hearing. Okay, so with this, Martin, then please pull up your camera and open your mic, and we're looking forward to your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Sorry for sending the slides so late, but I was just wondering, does it change anything if you put me later, last speaker, and in the meantime they upload it? Because it's a little bit complex, the EU climate policies. So without slides, I'm not too sure if it's so useful for the participants.
All right, let me talk to my colleagues here. Can we do this? Yeah. All right. Okay. So with this, then we're turning to the next speaker, who is here in Berlin, not in this very room with me, for the obvious reasons. We're all trying to do this COVID-19 compatible. His name is Michael Schäfer. Michael Schäfer is working with Agora Energiewende, an important think tank here in Berlin, advising on the energy transition as a senior advisor. Before he joined Agora, he was director for climate and energy at WWF Germany, and the members of the leadership team of WWF's international climate and energy practice. He worked also on politics. He was a member of the Berlin House of Representatives and the co-chairman of the Green Party. He has a diploma also in administrative studies, so I'm hoping can later in the discussion also maybe give us a little bit of or share his insights on how do you organize the deep transitions that we're hoping to see and the investments in the sectors that we're discussing from an organizational, a bureaucratic, and administrative, a process-focused point of view. So with this, Micha, you're on a little bit earlier than planned. I hope you're with us. May I ask you to open your camera and your microphone?
Yes, can you hear me?
Wonderful, yes. And my understanding is we have your slides and we're leading you through it.
Yeah.
They should already show. And please try to keep it to 7 or 8 minutes, if I may ask you that, so that we have time for the discussion. Up to you, Michael.
Thank you, Alexander, for the nice introduction and for giving me the opportunity to be here. Thank you all for joining. I'm talking about a dual stimulus program we have suggested as a think tank to the German government. Next slide, please. It contains 50, next slide, please. It contains 50 dual benefit measures, and well, they are mostly very country specific, but we try to identify the mechanisms behind them, so perhaps it can help you to develop in your development. So next slide, please. Normally you say there's you make the distinction between relief measures to help people who are in deep trouble or companies in deep trouble after COVID-19, recovery, get the economy back on track, and reform to address the structural problems of the economy like carbon neutrality, digitalization. Next slide, please. We are talking about recovery now. So what does a recovery package have to be in order to be effective? A large volume is very helpful. Speed to have a soon stimulus is good. Fresh money, if you can get it, of course, is very helpful. And the long-lasting effect. And on top of that, a forward-looking orientation. An economic stimulus package must not promote economic activity indiscriminately, but must look to the long-term goal. Next slide, please. Some say, let's get the economy back on track now and care about climate later. Well, that's not possible, as you can see in this graph. Every investment stimulus package is incentivizing is there over years or decades, and will still be there over decades. So there is no neutral stimulus. Every stimulus has a climate effect, and either you get it done now and combine them and try to aim for dual stimulus, dual use stimuli, or you may incentivize future stranded assets. Next slide, please. So this distinction I just made is a bit academic. Next slide. In practice, you see that policies, instruments are interlinked. Next slide, please. And what we look for is these interlinks where you sorry, that was too fast. Where you start policies in the recovery and can change them and develop them further in the reform phase. Next slide. One thing is most reform policies are developed revenue neutral, and a thing we did very often is tear them apart. Do the benefit first, and the malus, the co-financing phase later. So here can you look at one of our proposals, which the German government also took up in their actual package. We said, look at CO2, look at the prices for energy in Germany. And here you can see power consumption is taxed and tariffed very highly. And for example, if you look at the light heating oil, in comparison, you can easily see that there will not be a market dynamic to get heat pumps into the heating sector with this difference on taxes for energy consumption. So what we said is, now we want, for the recovery, we ask you to put prices down on energy consumption, and later, after 2 years or so, you can have higher taxes on light heating oil, on natural gas, in order to keep the lower prices for the power sector, and thus have a two-step reform which is helping for CO2 pricing. And there are other examples. For example, for the taxation of of vehicles, we have the government even also wants to have a reform that low emissions or no emission vehicles get a bonus in this taxation, and the high emitting vehicles, they get a malus. They have to pay more. But this malus will only be set in place later. That was our proposal here. So the splitting of reforms is one of the first mechanisms. Next slide, please. We had that. Next slide. Second thing is expansion of existing incentives, of course. It's difficult to set up a whole lot of new programs in a recovery program. It's better to take them, what you already have, and which are already working, put more money to it, or enhance them, enhancing them on other issues. This has also been done in China, where the government has just extended the tax exemptions and subsidies for electric vehicles that otherwise would have expired this year. So now they continue them for 2 more years, and this is a very regular thing and a wise thing to do in the phase of recovery. Next slide, please. Well, and the third third mechanism we identified is invest today in integrated infrastructures of tomorrow. So strengthen the solar and wind industry, of course, expansion of the charging infrastructure for e-mobility. All these investments would have to be done anyway. If you do them now, they can be part of the stimulus you give to your economy. Next slide, please. What is very important, it's not only about money. Often investments are not being made because there's no personal capacity in the permitting authorities, and there are other investment barriers. Here it is extremely important in a phase of a economic stimulus to get rid of these investment barriers and to try to incentivize investment also by this. Example, South Korea, which has a very interesting recovery package. The government established here training centers to retrain workers for the energy transition within its recovery program, because not having trained workers, of course, is also an investment barrier. Next slide, please. That was it. This was a very short version. As I've said, it's 50 dual stimulus measures we have in our proposal for Germany. We have translated it, and you find it on our website if you're interested to learn more about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been great, Michael. Thank you so much, and thank you for staying on time. I have several important questions, particularly how you see this relate to the situation in developing countries. But we can get to this in the discussion. Our next speaker is Marusha Kodama. Marusha has worked with multilateral institutions, governments, NGOs in more than 30 countries over the last 15 or so years. She has developed public policies, capacity projects. She has run multi-stakeholder partnerships in these countries, focused very much on sustainability and also equitable prosperity, a key issue, of course, in this series. She is the founder of the Comunitas Coalition, which is a multi-stakeholder coalition that advocates for SDG 11 on cities and human settlements. She has served as a Secretary General for the network of regional governments, been very involved in the UN Rio +20 conference, and now she is leading SLOCAT. SLOCAT is a global coalition of sustainable development initiatives in the mobile sector. I'm very, very glad to have her. We're working closely together on a project right now on integrating energy and transport solution on islands for APAC, which is also a project that's supported by the Let's Global Partnership. So without any further introduction, Marusha, over to you. You don't have slides, but please open your camera. I think we see already, microphone on, and off you go. Thanks, Marusha.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Alexander, for that very extensive introduction. It was a bit too much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and very impressed by what our colleagues have already been sharing. And think about SLOCAT as the international partnership that is trying to power knowledge and action for the transformation towards that paradigm of mobility that should be sustainable and low carbon based. And we actually try to bring the voice of that movement into international processes for climate and sustainability. And a lot has been said, and I'm pretty sure that much more will be said by the next panelist as well. So it's a bit difficult, you know, to try to add some value. And there's going to be a bit of repetition, perhaps, in what I'm saying. But hopefully, that will give you the impression that there is a way forward, and that there's clear things that we could be doing, and also risks that we should be avoiding. I think that what the COVID-19 situation has brought to the surface in the mobility and transport arena is things that we already knew. And things for which, to some extent, solutions do exist. The tragedy being that those solutions perhaps are never deployed at the scale and with the transformative potential that they have at full length. What we have seen as well on the transport arena is that mobility and access to transport is also a matter of socio-economic access, and it should be a right. We have seen that to what extent essential workers, for instance, have required transport and mobility services during the pandemic to keep on serving us. We have also seen how the transportation of goods has been absolutely essential to keep us supplied in moments in which we are shopping and buying online more than ever, or in moments in which, for instance, medical supplies were essential to all of us. I think that Alexander gave a great picture of why the transport sector in itself is really at the core of that transformation of our societies in terms of sustainability and in terms of climate action. And we have seen, therefore, how we can be a vehicle as a sector for that recovery, building back better, greener, more equitable and more resilient. But in order to do so, I think we have to bear in mind very closely when we put together these stimulus packages that a lot of strain right now is being placed on public transport systems, which are the backbone of any mobility system that is based on equity, that is based on accessibility, and that should be based also on affordability. If public transport systems collapse because we put our money in other areas, but we don't actually support our public transportation systems, we're going to be facing situations of equity much worse than what we have been facing already. And in many countries of the world, actually, public transportation doesn't exist. And it's the informal transport services driven by private sector that are actually giving millions of people the possibility to access their works and their jobs and to access socioeconomic opportunity. And of course, when you're a private sector entity and you're operating at a loss, you withdraw from the market. And of course, informal transport services have it particularly difficult to provide the social and physical distancing measures that are required in order to deliver a healthy and safe transportation system. So a lot of attention should be placed in the reality of informal transportation systems that low income and middle income countries are facing. And I think that the last thing that this pandemic has showed us as well is that there is willingness in all of us as citizens to question our mobility patterns. There's been a lot of what we call tactical urbanism being put in place by Indian cities, by African cities, by Latin American cities, showing us that pop-up bike lanes, that reclaiming streets for pedestrianization, for walking and cycling is possible, it's cost effective, and can actually be harnessed for the future. So as we look at these stimulus packages, I think it'll be the obligation really of the national governments, the international financial institutions, and the development cooperation entities behind them to certainly reconcile, as Alexander was telling us, that short-term imperative and that long-term imperative. And it's a delicate balance, absolutely. But in terms of the transportation system, from SLOCAT, we believe that the stimulus packages and the recovery packages should do a couple of things in particular. They should actually be putting all sectors of transport into a pathway towards decarbonization. If we are bailing out airlines, we should think as well about how is it that we're going to accompany them in a pathway of increased energy efficiency. And we are also going to be thinking about how we can potentially look for alternatives in railway, in speed railway, instead of flying, for instance, for domestic use. It'll also be very important that the stimulus packages by low income and middle income countries and oriented to support them could help to unleash investment in mobility infrastructure that is resilient and that is green at scale, something that we have not seen so far. Equally important will be as well to make sure that signals are sent to the market for clean mobility technologies and for manufacturers of vehicles to provide and pump into the market a sufficient amount and an affordable amount of vehicles, low emission vehicles, both for passenger and for freight. And last but not least, it'll be very important that these stimulus packages oriented towards a low income and middle income countries think about local authorities, think about local and regional governments that in the case of transport actually are bearing on their shoulders the operations of public transport, the transport authorities, and are doing it as well as a loss. Many of these local and regional governments have been pledging to replace fleets based on internal combustion engines by low carbon emitting vehicles. Think about electric buses, for instance, in cities. It's going to be very difficult for those pledges to actually be unfolded in developing countries if the stimulus and recovery packages are not actually supporting local authorities in particular to do so. But fundamentally, these stimulus packages and recovery packages can do a lot of things, but they have to have a clear policy orientation. And there is almost like a policy, like an overarching policy framework from the transport community that we feel should be championed as strongly as ever. And it's the avoid, shift, and improve framework. And it is in that order. There is a hierarchy. It's about avoiding unnecessary motorized trips. It's about shifting to less intensive, less carbon intensive modes of transportation. And it's about improving vehicle efficiency and fuel efficiency as a last resource. And with the strain put on public transport and the stigmatization that we're facing towards public transport, Rajat was already saying it, there is a risk to the return to the private car, to private motorization, and that would derail us tremendously from objectives of equity and objectives of decarbonization. So when we think about what these stimulus packages could be doing, for instance, in avoiding, we can think about a better integration between transport planning and land planning and land use. For instance, let's think about this idea of the 15-minute neighborhood, neighborhoods that are conceived with services around them, services as part of them, and that therefore are also more socially cohesive. When we think about avoiding, we can also think about the importance of access regulations, vehicle access regulations in cities that actually have a full governance mechanism behind them. Where we're thinking about shifting, of course, public transport should be central. And of course, that attention to informal transport services should also be very, very, very central. And when we're thinking about improving, let me evoke here 2- and 3-wheelers, for instance, which are essential and very fundamental in low and middle income countries. And they actually harness a lot of potential for much more systemic transformations on the electric grid and on infrastructure for provision of charging points, for instance. On improving as well, we could be thinking about freight, about the way goods get to our places, and about the way in which goods get to supermarkets or to hospitals. The opportunities for decarbonizing the last mile deliveries in low income and middle income countries are going to be really huge. Let me close, Alexandra, with a couple of thoughts on some other overarching ideas that these stimulus packages should bear in mind. And I wanted to have a word about policy coherence and another word about governance. It's going to be a very delicate balance, all these policy frameworks, isn't it? All these stimulus packages that are, financial frameworks, and they're going to have to respond to policy orientations. From the transportation sector, we would like to see those policy orientations, bearing in mind that transport and access to mobility should be considered as a public good. Public good that needs to be protected by public policy and by public expenditure from all those common bads that we face, including pandemics, for instance. Interesting as well is going to be the aspect of a just transition. Transforming transportation anywhere in the world is very much linked to jobs. We tend to think that it's only informal workers in the global south, but in the global north, we also have informal workers in what we call the ride-hailing services. Think about Uber, think about Grab, think about Lyft. So there is a huge component as well when we're talking about transforming the industrial sector that is based on internal combustion engine productions to other type of engines. And also the international frameworks, that notion of the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions that countries are going to have to submit this year to tell us how they are going about carbon emissions. We need a dramatic increase in ambition on transport. And very briefly, 30 seconds, if I may, Alexander, on governance. A lot of the measures we see, particularly in low-income and middle-income countries, that revolutionize transport are private sector driven because they're actually trying to fill the gap of what public sector is not able to do. It's phenomenal that we have that private sector driven innovation. Perhaps what we can think about is about the public policy goals, the public good, the public common goods, that the common good goals that these private sector driven innovations could actually be oriented towards, in order to have a certain notion of public policy oversight or common goods oversight in this huge investment from the private sector. Thank you very much, and back to you, Alexander.
Thank you, Marusha. Great as always, and you're already receiving some kudos on the chat for introducing your as I avoid, shift, and improve framework, and that's reassuring because we're also implementing that very much in the roadmap work that we're doing together. So thanks so much. This was great. Back to you, Martin. I think we've been able now to pull up your presentation, and that's ready to go. My colleague will share the screen. I've introduced Martin Kasper already. He is with the Climate Finance Unit of DG Klima in the European Commission. Martin, over to you. Please open your mic and your camera. Thank you.
Hello, do you hear me?
Go ahead. We can hear you well.
Good. So sorry, hello, thanks for having me, and sorry again for sending the slides so late, but it's a busy time, still no air of holiday mood in Brussels, so we are really full speed. You already introduced me very kindly, Alexander, so just to say that my specialty is really, as you said, EU climate connections, climate relations with third countries, China, Asia, parts of Africa. So I'm not the deep specialist on many aspects of the EU climate policies. However, of course, I have a relatively good overview. I try to cover in a few minutes a very large field. So whenever there are questions afterwards, obviously I try to answer. If not, I might come back to you a little bit later and we can continue the chat, the discussion. Maybe I'll also leave my email address, so we can also continue after the event. I sort of giving you a very quick broad picture of where EU climate policies stand, because this recovery package that the European Commission proposed on the 27th of May is really building upon what happened until now. And it's hard to understand without getting a little bit the overview. This first slide, I put together key dates that many of you will know anyway, but just to recall, of course, the Paris Agreement 2015 included NDCs, INDCs at the time from basically all the parties to the UN Climate Convention, with the commitment to update them and strengthen them by the end of this year, and also to come forward with long-term strategies. From our side, so we have our EU NDC submitted in 2015, but we are aware that we should go further, and this is a bit now how we aim to strengthen our commitments. So most of the slides that I'll show in a minute is about actually what is called a clean planet for all, which is the EU's proposal to become, let's say the European Commission's proposal to become climate neutral by 2050, which is obviously a huge undertaking, an extremely ambitious effort. But this is, let's say, the most detailed planned climate program that we have for the moment in the European Union. So that's with an impact assessment, with a public consultation behind it. So that's the reason I think where it's still, even if the paper is now 1.5 years old, it's still valid to spend a few slides and minutes on it. In December last year, just before actually during the Madrid climate conference, the new European Commission, our new leadership here in Brussels, presented what is called the European Green Deal, which is obviously linking up to the US discussion, the European Green Deal, but let's see, more ambitious than what our American friends produce for the moment. Which strengthens the current target of -40% greenhouse gases to a -50 or -55. So a reduction by 50 or 55% of greenhouse gases in the European Union as compared to 1990. So already with the current commitment of -40%, our 27 member states, some of them are really challenged, but we from the European Commission side, we propose to go higher. So to a reduction of up to -55%. Then obviously, so the March 2020, that was the moment when COVID struck also in Europe. But this was just actually a few days before Europe went into lockdown in mid-March. I think it was the 9th of March. Officially, we submitted this long-term strategy, this climate neutrality goal that I mentioned, to UNFCCC. So this now became official EU policy that there is this important policy target of getting climate neutral by 2050. Then mid-March, COVID struck fully in Europe. And in May 2020, the European Commission proposed a package which is called Repair and Prepare for the Next Generation, a massive stimulus program. And I come to that towards the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So this is a couple of slides from the 2018 climate neutrality strategy. Just to give you a flavor without going in any details here. But this is the, let's say, the long-term vision to 2050. You will see that it's impossible to get completely out of greenhouse gases. But the idea being that the remaining small emissions 2050 would basically be absorbed by LULUCF, basically by forestry, agriculture, and potentially by CCS, carbon capture and storage. Next one, please. So here, how did we come to this climate neutrality target 2050? So you see it's based on, we are doing a lot with scenario analysis with different scenarios. So different pathways to get to climate neutrality. Again, no time to go into any details, but you see these scenarios have different focuses. And you have a couple of keywords in the blue line, which are strong in the discussion now: electrification, hydrogen, power to X, energy efficiency, obviously. And then you're basically a combination scenario and different features of the scenarios, and also how far they bring us in terms of the 2050 reduction score. Next one, please. What are the building blocks? So this were the scenarios for 2050 before. What are the building blocks? Basically, most of these issues are well known, but and we don't have to go into them now. But just to say with which are the main elements, the work areas we have to work on to reach climate neutrality by 2050. Next one. And also to stress again, still on the 2050 strategy, how embedded these climate policies are in the wider social and economic field. So you have a strong, an issue which is very strong in Europe for the moment. If you look to the right side down, a digital single market, so the digitalization of the society, research and innovation. Obviously, you have a broad agenda of competition policy, trade, where the European Commission has quite some competences, taxation. So you have all these mega issues in which the climate policies are embedded. Next one. This is I kept this from the general presentation because I just wanted to put in the discussion this phrase of just transition, which also got traction in Europe since maybe around 2 years, because also in the European Union we have still coal-dependent areas, and you have to offer something to the regions in terms of growth strategies, compensation maybe. So this just transition is not only a slogan that we propose to our partners, but which is important inter-EU to compensate, I don't want to say losers, but to compensate regions with have structural issues with coal production. For example, we are reaching out now to other regions. For example, last year we had I think quite successful mission from the main coal province of South Africa to the European Union, which also visit our member states to see how this issue is approached in Europe. Next one. So now we shift from the climate neutrality strategy to December 2019, when the European Green Deal was proposed. This is a single slide, and it's a complex whole society approach. The documentation, the communication is around 20 pages from December. Can send you the link, but it might be worth having a look. But just the only thing which I want to stress here is on the left upper green field, increasing the EU's climate ambition for 2030 and 2050. Yeah? And so what I said before, this is with the Green Deal, the aim is really to, let's say it's a midterm strategy until 2030, and the aim is to strengthen the EU's greenhouse gas reduction targets from the current -40 to -50 to 55. And the Green Deal is the December 2019 package, how we want to get there. But for the moment, it's a European Commission proposal, and it's not yet EU policy. Next one, please. So now we shift again to May 2020, which is now the green recovery approach from the European Commission. It's a huge package, almost 2,000 billion euro. And the approach here is to combine the next year EU budget for the years 21 to 27 with a shorter term, which is around 1,100 billion euro, with a shorter term, about 2 or 3 years, immediate recovery reaction program. And the general, and there are many, you see many facilities, many programs, InvestEU, for example, no time to go into them. But the general approach, I would say, is that the member states, our 27 member states, propose national programs, which should have a strong green and digitalization angle. And basically, the European Commission would finance these national programs partially with funds which are taken up from the capital markets. Next one. So this is the policy fundamentals of this green recovery package. And I put in red, obviously, the green aspect. So a massive renovation wave, which obviously would create a lot of jobs. In my own country, Austria, we are currently at 0.7% annual renovation rate of buildings. That should go up to 2 or 3% of building renovation per year. So that you have this win-win of doing something for the climate, win-win-win, cutting the energy bills, creating jobs. Renewable energy, we know all, hydrogen is coming as a strong issue. The German government recently proposed its hydrogen strategy. We are working on a hydrogen strategy on the European level. Clean transport, topic of the issue, the Just Transition Fund, the Just Transition issue that I mentioned before. Let's skip the single market and the economic issues. Next one, please. Yeah, so next steps, that's the last one. Just to remind that here I'm speaking from the European level basically, but the main decisions are taken on the level of the 27 member states, or even on lower subnational level. And basically now our member states delivered national climate and energy plans 2020 to 2030. We have received most of them. And all of them with a strong climate reduction ambition, as we said before. Now this month, middle of the month, 17th, 18th of July, we hope to get a political agreement on the recovery package as a whole, which should include what I shortly presented before, repair and prepare for the next generation, which should have at least 25% climate finance 25% climate finance aspect. In September 2020, we will come out with an impact assessment, how in detail the -50, -55% greenhouse gas reduction could be reached. And by the end of 2020, we want to keep the deadline of submitting the EU NDC with a strengthened greenhouse gas reduction target. International cooperation, Africa, China, India, Latin America, there's no time about it now, but happy to discuss if there's an interest. And also to say that climate change will also be a strong element in our international cooperation budget for 21-27. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. This was great. All of you guys were great. Were very exciting statements, I believe. I wish we had some time now to all digest this and come up with questions, but that luxury we don't have. We have about 15 minutes left now for discussion. And though I have several questions that I'd like you to follow up on, I want to really give preference here to our audience. Now I see there's a little bit of a mix-up here between the question and answer stream of getting involved with us and the chat function. I saw that one project developer for PV is already registering his interest in working with this community we're creating here through the Let's GP and the folks involved in the discussion here. Put those comments rather in the chat section, if I may ask you. And I've also seen that there were some questions that were formulated in the chat section. So the questions that you have for our panelists, please put that in the Q&A stream. So one question was directed at Rajat. Rajat, what are the current policy discussions in India around the so-called prosumer, so around decentralized energy solutions towards then achieving universal energy access, clean, affordable, reliable energy, so the so-called SDG 7. Rajat, do you want to take this question?
Sure. Thanks, Alexander. I think that's a wonderful question. Now, pre-COVID and post-COVID could sort of be, there will be sort of, maybe there will be a policy change around that. But pre-COVID, definitely, you know, distributed energy system, especially in rural areas, by trying to create communities who could, you know, get access through distributed energy systems, especially renewable energy, were there, but they hadn't been scaled up. So scaling up has proved to be a challenge, especially in rural areas. And again, in the rooftop solar, there's been some amount of success. There's been a policy that has been sort of implemented by the government, including a capital subsidy that has been given. And it's been a sort of joint initiative between the central and state government in India. And some states have done better than others. With respect to the target that we have that we made a commitment in Paris, out of the 100 gigawatts of solar energy, 40 is supposed to come from solar rooftops. And I think that's sort of an ambitious target, given that it hasn't been very, very successful. But, you know, we've integrated that into the new building code that India has implemented. There are as I said, there are distributed energy success stories in certain states. Challenges to replicate what those success stories are in other states, and also with sort of I think the financial situation of the DISCOMs, as I had mentioned during my presentation, that continues to be a key bottleneck in trying to implement not only decarbonization of the grid, but also in the penetration of solar rooftop, as well as not so much the distributed energy systems, but certainly in the proliferation of the sort of solar rooftop model that we have implemented in India.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rajat. Very concise answer. There's two questions here I see that are focused on, okay, we understand the green economy, a green recovery has the potential to create a lot of jobs. I would say this is a proven fact. But what do we do about those that are left behind? How can we make sure that they are not left behind? What do we do with the energy sectors that are conventional, the transport folks who work on conventional technologies that over time we aim to phase out for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, including our climate objectives. There are several questions here that are relating to that. Can there be a compensation fund for those? Other things that come to mind is retraining them to give them an opportunity to enter new sustainable sectors. Maybe I can put you on spot here, Martin. You know, working for the European Union, I'm sure you're dealing with lobby groups, you're dealing with interest organizations of those more conventional technologies that might be highly polluting, that are bringing this argument forward and say, so what about us? Like, who's thinking of us? Maybe I can ask you to discuss this a little bit. Are there any ideas about compensation? How do you create a just transition? You were speaking about this, but maybe you can focus a little bit more on those who might have lost their jobs now in those traditional non-green, gray, brown, however you want to call this areas. What are the ideas of the European Union there? Martin? And you know, as you're putting up your microphone and your camera for the other panelists, you know, feel free to open at least your camera, if not your microphone for now, so that we see you and we can create more of a circle discussion here. But this one was for you, Martin Kaspar.
So does it work? So yeah, on the lobbying question, it's a delicate question. I personally am not really a target, as I'm mostly working on the external files. But I mean, for example, we have a good cooperation with Business Europe, which is the umbrella organization of national EU industrial associations. And I mean, of course, there are some differences of opinion, but I think on the general line of raising ambition and of being ambitious, I think there is quite a consensus with large parts of the industries. In terms of compensation, that's what I mentioned before. The classical cases are the coal regions, and yes, there has this just transition funds been set up. This is going up strongly in the next budget, so that's clearly an issue which will be a region which will compensate it. As I have the floor, quickly on two questions which I've seen to me on PV waste. I can't say. I can look into it, but in principle that should be covered by the circular economy approach. So we recently presented a circular economy strategy, and I would very much hope that this is covered there, but I can dig into it. And is the 2050 climate neutrality vision still relevant? Very much so. As I said, it's not only a strategy, that's official EU position now. So of course there are different opinions, but again, it's official position, and that's definitely the direction to go. There's no doubt about it. Thanks.
Can we stay with you for just a second? And I agree that the lobbying question was a tough one. But since you're working on the external relations of the EU, one question is really, how do you internationalize the EU new Green Deal? What's your ideas about supporting cooperation between Europe and the developing world, developing regions, Africa, Asia, parts of Latin America? Maybe you can concretely tell us a little bit about, focus is now everywhere in the world, very much on, you know, our own surroundings, our own environments, our own economies. But is the EU already actively involved in focusing on international cooperation towards green recovery? It will be at the center of the discussion next week. Then we move international cooperation at the center. But since we have you, Martin, and you're very experienced in this field, maybe we can stay with you for a moment before we move on.
Yes, of course. So there's an active climate diplomacy. We're reaching out to many partners. I can give you the example of China, maybe more than 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. So there we had an EU-China summit last Monday, and we are actively cooperating on emission trading, for example, where the Chinese system should get operational this year. We are asking in favor of earlier peaking, of also potentially a domestic climate neutrality vision, of getting out of overseas coal investments. So these are concrete topics we are discussing. And obviously, it's difficult, but we try to focus firstly on big emitters G20, secondly on the most affected, the most vulnerable through classical development assistance cooperation. So we're reaching out, but we are relatively small entities, so we're very much stretched. But it truly means we are aware that EU is less than 10% of global emissions, so we have to reach out.
Alexander, I don't know if we would have time for me to chime in on the question of development cooperation, but you are leading it, so tell me off, no problem.
I would like to stay with you for a moment and ask you basically the same question on transport. You know, you are creating this international partnership around sustainable transport. How do you make, how do you bring everybody on board? The situation is so different depending on the country or regional context. We have super modern and far developed speed trains in parts of Europe, but we have also areas in the world where mobility is really a challenge just to get from one village to the next. How do we create these learning efforts across regions and across countries?
Well, thanks very much for that question. It's of course the crux of it, isn't it? One size doesn't fit all in any aspect, and certainly not in transport and mobility either. I think that the conversation about a sustainable low carbon transport is not a conversation about let's not build any road anywhere in the world. It's not about that. We know very much that in certain countries, basic transport infrastructure, including roads, is still essential in terms of development, isn't it? And in terms of providing access to opportunity to everyone. But it's very much about not replicating mistakes that have been done in the past. It's about very much decoupling the notion of economic growth, and let me now erase growth and say prosperity, because it has a very different connotation. So it's about decoupling the notion of economic prosperity with the notion of just needing a car, for instance. As this LOCAT, we have the opportunity of supporting some of the multilateral development banks in making a bit of an in-depth study about how the voluntary national reviews of the sustainable development goals by certain countries and the nationally determined contributions by certain countries in the framework of the Paris Agreement are actually going about it. How are they going about decoupling the notion of economic prosperity from mobility patterns, traditional mobility patterns that are based on very carbon intense transportation. So that is really the objective here. And it's very much about sharing the experience. It's very much about helping with the notion of leapfrogging. And it's very much about context-based and cost-efficient solutions. To some extent, in many occasions, when we're looking at transforming transportation in the global south, we tend to think that potentially a big infrastructure project with a lot of money behind it and a very intensive preparation process is going to take us very far away. And we tend to forget some soft measures that are perhaps more cost-efficient, that are going to take us to that leapfrogging of behavioral patterns and culture towards mobility. Let me pick up again the example of tactical urbanism. It is Kigali during pandemic times that has actually reclaimed streets for people. It's actually many Indian cities who have put back in place systems of shared bikes. It is Bogota or Medellin who have dramatically increased, even before the COVID-19 broke out in their cities, improvised bike lanes that could actually allow people to still be able to move without facing other congested, let's say, means of transport. So there is a lot to learn there. Peer-to-peer and leapfrogging are words that sound very basic and that we tend to repeat a lot, but are very essential. And I think that they also play a very important space in development cooperation. And development cooperation somehow, let me be, SLOCAT is an NGO, so let me be a bit of that provocative NGO activist, if you would allow me for a second, Alexander. But I think that in development cooperation is an area where we also sometimes face difficulties of policy coherence. In development cooperation, many factors come in, isn't it? Comes the willingness of a country to support in solidarity terms other countries, comes in the trade policy of a country, comes in the international framework, isn't it, that governs the wider orientations of development cooperation. So it's going to be very interesting to see how traditional development cooperation agencies and development cooperation policies are going to help us in that very, very important effort of policy coherence. So we are not exporting, on the one hand, problems from the global north to the global south, whether it is by exporting second-hand EVs that will not match the standards that we need, or whether it is, sending the batteries somewhere there without actually looking into the recycling part of it, or whether it is trying to sell cars in the global south instead of actually helping completely transform mobility patterns. So just a thought to be provocative in the interest of a conversation and in the interest of leaving some food for thought for the next webinar that I know you've got that is particularly oriented to that topic. Thanks, Alexander. Back to you.
Super, Marusha. This was great, and your deep understanding of this is, of course, why it's so great to have SLOCAT lead on the transport working group, a close partner of the energy working group in the Let's Global Partnership. We have run out of time, but I have one more question for Michael Schäfer from Agora. Before we move on, and this is really your final chance as a global community out there that has joined us. I think we had more than 100 people now calling in. It's fabulous turnout, so interesting topic, of course, and fabulous speakers. It's all to your credit. We have a poll in the end where we like trying to learn from you, so please stay with us for the last few minutes. And for that, I will ask you, Michael Schäfer, to remain relatively short. But I'd like to ask you a difficult question still, with limited time. What's your key takeaway in designing the double booster for Germany, integrating the energy and the transport sector, providing very concrete recommendations to the German government? What's your takeaway in selecting specific policies and measures and technologies, solutions over others? What's your key takeaway if you were now to be brought to an African country or to Asia to advise them with designing their own package? What is your number one, or I got to give you two, okay? What are your two most important learnings that you can bring into that advisory? And then after that, we wrap up. Please.
Learning number one is there's loads of money out there, and if you can provide long-term investment security, legal security, this can help you so much with your recovery. Learning number two is if you design policies, think of think of two phases. First, try to get some benefit, and then in the future, this benefit, people want to keep it, and try to refinance it wisely, like with CO2 pricing, these splitting of reforms. And perhaps a third one, use the possibilities you have now. Like we have pop-up bike lanes coming here. We have pop-up pedestrian walks because people want to sit outside in summer and they cannot because of the distance of approvals. And so some cities just say, okay, on this street there are no more cars anymore because we need them for the people. And this is, I think, something, this pop-up policy, I would say, try to put people first now. That's the third advice I'd like to give. And thank you to a wonderful host, because I have the last word here. Thank you so much for organizing that and making it done.
Wow, this is almost staged now, because that gives me a fabulous transition to thanking everyone who has been involved here. You only see me, but there's quite a big team behind this at ST Strategies. I want to thank Kate and Apostolis, my colleagues. I want to thank Lars and Bertolt and their colleagues here at Renark again for hosting us. I'm looking over because some of them are watching us live here in the room, which brings down the participants numbers. That's not a good thing, actually. That was a joke. Then our colleagues, obviously, is the Transport Working Group of the Let's Global Partnership, our colleagues in the Global Secretariat, Rodrigo, Julia, Marilyn. Thank you all so much for making this possible. Thanks most to our panelists. We have a third session coming up next Thursday. Everybody involved here has written something about it. So if you're interested in the topic, I encourage you to look up their names. There's fabulous reports out there. There's a lot more to learn about this. Let's make this deep, just transition happen to a more sustainable world. I hope we could make a little contribution to it, and I thank you very much. And with this, I'm going to the poll. If we can pull this up, and it starts now. Goodbye.